Reteach 4.1 mole test. To calculate between moles, grams, atoms, and liters, you've got to set up your conversion factors by knowing that 1 mole is equal to the formula mass in grams of any compound, and that's also equal to 6.02 to the 23rd atoms, molecules, or formula units of the same compound, and that's also equal to 22.4 liters of the same compound. So in question 1, the mole is a unit of chemistry that measures the quantity of of elements or compounds. 2, what is molar mass and how do you calculate the molar mass? That's adding up each mass in a compound for the total from the periodic table. That's the same value as the formula mass. Calculate the molar mass for each of the following compounds. Go to the periodic table and add up their masses for how many you have of each element. Add them up for a total. Number 4, what's the difference in molar mass and formula mass? Well, it's the same number, but it has a different unit. Formula mass just has the unit of grams, while molar mass will have the same number for that same compound, but the unit will be written as grams divided by moles, or grams per mole. Question 5, show how you'd add up your formula mass for Fe2O3. Go to the periodic table, multiply iron's mass by 2, and add it to the multiplication of 3 oxygen atoms for the total mass. Question 6, what is Avogadro's value and what does it represent? Avogadro's value is 6.02 to the 23rd atoms, and that represents 1 mole of any element or any compound. 7, how many liters are occupied by any gas substance in 1 mole? Well, that's 22.4 liters is equal to 1 mole. When making conversion factors, what would you have to do to convert from a given number in grams for a particular compound? You would set it up so that grams of the compound would go on the bottom, plugging in your formula mass from adding up on the periodic table, and putting mole on top, so you'd have 1 mole on top over the formula mass to make a conversion from grams to moles. So that's how you set up and look at the other conversion factors, such as in number 9, how would you convert from mole to mass? Well, if you were given a number in moles, so if you had a number of moles, you would set up your ratio so that mole would go on the bottom to cancel out, and you'd have grams on top. That means you'd have 1 in front of mole, and you'd go back and find your formula mass to plug it in front of grams right there. Page 2. Again, you've got to set up your conversions. If you're given a number, a unit, and a compound, that's what you have to start out on the left, having on this side. Then your ratio for your conversion is always going to take whatever unit and substance that is and bring it down to here. So in addition to writing moles there, you should have moles of O2, and that's always going to be 1 mole is equal to the formula mass in grams of the oxygen. So you've got to add up from your periodic table 2 oxygen's mass and plug it in on top. So your multiplication would be 1.26 times the formula mass of O2 on the top to get your answer. The mole value here gets divided by this mole value and cancels out. You're left with the unit that's on top. So in your answer, your unit and your answer should be that it's grams of oxygen after you do your multiplication and plug in the formula mass to get your answer. And that's the same process that you have to do for all the rest of these calculations. You've got to have your beginning number, the unit and the compound that it is, move then that unit substance down to the bottom for it to divide and cancel out, and put the unit you're asked to solve for on top. Then you can plug in your number values here and here that make the top unit equal to the bottom unit, based on knowing that 1 mole is equal to 4 different things. Equal to formula mass in grams. It's equal to Avogadro's number, 6.02 to the 23rd atoms or molecules, or it's equal to 22.4 liters of a gas. So you've got to use those equal values to make your conversions. Now on page 3, if you're converting from moles to liters, you're following the process of taking your unit and substance down to the bottom so it'll cancel out. So this would be moles of CO2. and I'm going to liters of CO2 on top, still in the same substance, but my moles divided by moles of CO2 will cancel out. My answer should have liters of CO2 in it. And when you multiply 0.58 times 22.4, you'll get your number that would fit in to answer that question. Down towards the bottom where you have percent composition, your percent calculation, percent equation should be whatever element you have that's on top, your individual element values. And if you have more than one of that individual element on top, you've got to account for it on top. And you got to divide it by its formula mass for the whole compound and times it by 100 to get it to a percent. Then down on empirical molecular formula, you need to know the difference. Empirical is the simplest, easiest form of a compound. When you look at the formula, the subscripts could not be reduced, while a molecular formula is a more complex structure that has subscripts that could be reduced. So for example, in 24, where you have C2H12O16, that's a molecular formula because it has a 2, 12, and a 16 as subscripts that have a common denominator and can be reduced down to get the empirical formula, which would be CH6O8. Okay, page 4, to calculate from percent to finding your chemical formula. Remember we had our cheat sheet that we followed the steps, and we had basically these 5 steps. Drop off your percent sign and change it to grams. Then convert that gram value to moles, keeping all the numbers in your calculator so you can compare those mole answers and divide out by the smallest value. Then keep that answer to 2 places after the decimal so that you could look for having after the decimal point the possibility of a 0.25, and if you have that, you got to multiply by 4, or the possibility of 0.33 or 0.66. If you have that, you'd multiply everything by 3, or if you had 0.5, you'd multiply everything by 2 to get the quantity of each of your elements, and then you write your formula.